All right, so there are rolling thunderstorms all around me right now. Therefore, you're going to hear a lot. And I'm going to preamble for a bit, so don't hate me too much because I have some things that I want to say before this poem becomes, and you've heard me poeticize in every which way. So I'm just getting stuff out there. Um okay, I should be cleaning my house, but I'm here. And I'm here because I was reminded of something that brought me comfort. I'm not necessarily sure why I'm breathing it through, and why it's coming forth, or why I'm even putting it out there, but I'm going to first start with a poem from a WordPress.com website. It might be a poem, I'm not sure where it's from, but it, I don't know, it brings me a lot of closure. And then I'll talk about another situation. So, this one's called, not my poem, but the poem that I said I was going to read before. It's called You're a Wizard, Harry, because your parents or some ancestor was a wizard. It's often called genetic magic, but since it doesn't usually work like genetics at all, let's call it hereditary magic rather. You were born when the moon was in the 8th house of Aquarius or some other astrological occurrence. What happened with other people who share your birth date? You have lived in a certain place for long enough. Unlike astrological magic origins, you do not necessarily have to be born there unless you are a hermit. Other people will probably have magic too. And what happens when you leave? You performed some deed. This might be a one of a kind thing or staple of your culture. Hunting certain beasts, climbing mountains or towers, kill the demon lord? You found an artifact or several of them. Who made this thing? Why were they wizards? Are they similar things? You made a deal, usually a pact, or again, several of them. What's your end of the bargain? What kind of entities make these pacts? Why? You had a very, very bad day, and boom, the magic happened. Such triggered outbreaks do not necessarily entail you wearing a cape. Oh, and try to be nice to people, otherwise they might boom, magic. You got medicinal treatments. Who performed them? Who else got those too? What are the side effects? You learned how. Where can one learn? What learning resources are there if it's institutionalized? Who owns the institution? Why have they set it up? What are the requirements to get in? Am I missing something? Probably. And of course, several of these might come into play together. So before each sentence that I read, you're supposed to go, You're a wizard, Harry, because you were born when the moon. You're a wizard, Harry, because you have lived in a certain place, right? And I have that as a tab that's just always open, never closes. And it also reminded me of a Reddit post. This guy, he was like, My soul doesn't talk to me. What does that mean? Am I doing it wrong? And then without skipping a beat, this one guy said, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't supposed to. And I hated that, but I also loved it at the same time. And that all brought me here. And this poem is called That Does Not Mean That I Will Not Still Try. Coping. There are people in every story who are born with a window already open. The wind comes through them, the candle bends towards them, the room hushes itself when they speak. They say, I knew, I felt it, I heard it. And I sat among them with my hands folded so tightly that my palms remembered the shape of prayer long after I had stopped. I have looked at their certainty like a child outside a house in winter, face against the glass, watching everyone else eat. What do you mean you heard him? What do you mean you knew where to go? What do you mean there was a voice and it sounded like love and it called your name and you followed it through the dark like somebody walking home? Because I have stood in the same dark and heard only my own breathing. Only the old machinery of fear, only the clock, only the terrible and ordinary sound of wanting. Wanting to hear, wanting to know, wanting to be the sort of person for whom heaven opens a little, for whom the curtain trembles, for whom the answer arrives not as a riddle or a silence or a door that never quite unlatches, but as a voice, clear, certain, merciful. I have wanted it with the desperation of thirst. I have wanted it so badly that I began to think my wanting itself must be proof of some failure. Perhaps I was standing wrong. Perhaps I was praying wrong. Perhaps everyone else had been given some invisible inheritance. You are a wizard, Harry. No, not me. Perhaps they were born with it, some hereditary magic of the spirit, some ancient bloodline of certainty moving through the generations like a family heirloom, like blue eyes, like grief. Perhaps their souls came into the world already knowing the language, already tuned to a frequency that my heart has never been able to catch. Perhaps they were born under the right sky, the moon in the right house, the stars leaning close enough to whisper. Perhaps they climbed the mountain, perhaps they found the artifact, perhaps they made the deal, perhaps they had the terrible day that cracked them open and let the light pour in. And perhaps I have spent so much of my life waiting for the boom, for the revelation, for the moment when the walls would split apart and suddenly I would become the sort of person who hears, the sort of person who knows, the sort of person for whom God is not a room full of silence but hand upon the shoulder. And because it did not happen, I began to fear that I had been forgotten, that everyone else had been invited and I had not, that there was some great choir rising somewhere beyond me and I was pressing my ear against the wrong wall. But then one day, in the middle of my grief, in the middle of the same old ache, I came across a sentence so small and so merciful that it felt less like being struck by lightning and more like someone finally opening the curtains. God knows that you cannot hear God's voice, and I do not know why that sentence undid me. Perhaps because for the first time I understood that my silence was not news, that heaven was not standing over me with crossed arms, waiting for me to become what I have never been, that God was not saying, "Why can you not do what everyone else does?" But instead, I know that you strain toward the door until your whole body aches. I know that you replay every silence as though it were a crime scene. I know that you sit among people who speak of certainty as though it were sunlight, and you wonder what terrible thing has made you nocturnal. I know that you love me. I know that you are trying. I know that you would hear me if you could. And something in me, something exhausted, something that had been kneeling for so long it had forgotten how to stand, began to weep. Because maybe grace is not finally being given the ears. Maybe grace is being told that your deafness was already accounted for. That before the beginning of the world, before the stars, before language, before the first frightened prayer rose out of the first frightened body, there was already a place made for the ones who would not hear, for the ones who would not know, for the ones who would spend their lives mistaking silence for rejection. Maybe there are rooms in heaven built especially for the bewildered. Maybe there are angels whose only task is to sit beside those of us who never learn the language and say, "You are not failing, you are not late, you are not broken. You are simply walking a road that does not look like theirs." And perhaps that is why I think of Glinda. Yes, Glinda the good from Wicked. Glinda, all gold and brightness, standing in a world that values magic like proof, like currency, like destiny. And still there are things she can do that no spell can touch. To stay, to love, to grieve, to bless, to witness, to place her hands around the unbearable without needing to transform it. Maybe there are people whose gift is not hearing the voice, but enduring the silence without letting it make them cruel. Maybe there are people whose gift is not certainty, but tenderness. People who never receive the map and still continue walking. People who do not know, and do not know, and do not know, and yet every morning they rise and make tea, and answer messages, and pray badly, and keep loving, and keep choosing clumsily, and keep returning like the tide returns to a shore that has never once called it by name. There is a kind of something in that, a something nobody writes songs about, the something of the person who never sees the burning bush but keeps walking through the desert anyway, the something of the person who hears no voice from heaven but still leaves a place at the table, the something of the person who cannot see what others see, cannot hear what others hear, and still says, "I am here, I am trying, I do not understand, but I am here." And perhaps that has always been enough. Perhaps the soul knows what it can and cannot do. Perhaps God does too. Perhaps all this time I have been standing before a locked door begging it to become a window when the mercy was never in entering. The mercy was in discovering that I had never been shut out. That even here in the uncertainty, in the terrible unfinishedness, in the country of unanswered questions, I am still held. Not despite the fact that I cannot hear, because God already knows that I cannot. And still somehow, I am loved. Thank you.